Hello there, my name is Dan Vega and I'm a Spring Developer Advocate for VMware. Today, I want to go in and build a new Spring Boot application that connects to a database, and we're going to use a project called Spring Data JDBC. Now, you may have heard of a project called Spring Data JPA, which is by far the most popular project underneath the Spring Data umbrella, but that is using an ORM, or an Object Relational Mapper, and specifically using Hibernate. And Hibernate is great, but if you're brand new to Spring Boot and brand new to Spring Data, if you've never used an ORM before, it can be a little overwhelming at first. So Spring Data aims to kind of simplify a lot of the pain of getting started with something like Hibernate. So we'll talk more about some of the nuances as we go along. If you have used JPA before, I want you to kind of forget some of that because you may be trying to use Spring Data JDBC like you would with JPA, and that's not the case. So what we're going to do, let's start building a blog application. And as we go along, we'll take a look at the documentation. We'll talk about some of the concepts that are going to come up, and we'll have some fun doing it along the way. So I'm over here at start.spring.io, our second favorite place on the internet. And this is a great place to go ahead and bootstrap a new Spring Boot application. So I'm choosing Maven as my build tool. I'm choosing Java as my language. I'm choosing 2.7.4, which is the latest stable release of Spring Boot. And what I'm going to do is come in here and add a group. So I'm going to say dev.danvega. The artifact is going to be blog. And all of this information looks pretty good. Now I need some dependencies. I'm going to add Spring Web. I'm also going to add Spring Data JDBC. And then for that, we'll also need a database. So I'm going to use H2, which is a nice in-memory database. Really kind of helps simplify this particular project. And anytime you're trying to just kick up a tutorial or a demo or a proof of concept, H2 is a really great choice. So with that, I will go ahead and hit generate. It is going to download a zip. I can then go ahead and open that in my favorite IDE, which is IntelliJ. You can open it up in whatever IDE or text editor you're most comfortable with. And with that, we'll go ahead and start writing some code. All right, the first thing we got to come in here and do is go ahead and open up source main Java. And we will go ahead and create a new package in here. We'll call this model. And we're going to start with the idea of a blog post. So we're going to create a new class called post. I'm going to leave this as a regular post or a regular class, not a record, as I usually do, because we're going to have to do some things in here that we'll get to later, and I'd like to keep it this way for now. So what we need to do is we need to create a few fields in here. So I'm going to say private integer ID, private string title. We'll also have some string content. And what I also want to do is add a local date time for when it was published. So published on. And then I'll do the same for what it was updated on. So I'll say updated on. And then eventually we will tie an author and some comments to this as well, but we'll come back to that a little bit later. So what I want to do now is create a constructor. So this constructor is going to take in a title, and it's going to take in some content, and that's really it. So we could say this.title is equal to title, this.content is equal to content. And then what I'm going to do is go ahead and set the published on equal to the local date time now. And then we'll just go ahead and leave the updated value. So updated on will be null. So we'll store that as null in the database. And the reason for that is when I publish an article, I want that time to be displayed. And only when the updated on is not null do I want to go ahead and display that, and letting the user know, letting the viewer know that, hey, this article may have been published last year, but it was just updated recently. So that is a good start. We'll go ahead and create some getters and setters here. We will also go ahead and create a toString. And that looks good. Now, one last thing with Spring Data JDBC, we have to mark the field that is going to be our ID with the @ID annotation. So this is coming from org.springframework.data.annotation.id. different than JPA. If you've used JPA in the past, you know this is coming from something like javax.persistence. So that's not what that is here. So we have our ID. The next thing we need to do is go ahead and create a table that will line up with this post. So I'm going to go under source main resources, and I'm going to create a new file. We're going to call this schema.sql. And what we need to do is let's actually get rid of these first. So we're going to change the dialect to, this is going to be H2, and I can go ahead and disable this inspection. So we're going to have a post table. We'll say create table post. And I always forget that semicolon, so let's add that now. So we're going to have an ID, which is going to be an int. We'll say this is auto increment. We'll have the primary key. I'm also going to go ahead and add a version. We'll talk about this as we go. It's really specific. It's kind of specific to Spring Data JDBC on how we know it's gonna, how we know we're creating a new one or updating an existing one. You can get away with this when you first start, but you may need this later. So I'm going to go ahead and also have a title. So we'll say this is a varchar 255, not null. We'll also have the content as text. We don't want that null. And then we'll have published on. So that's going to be a timestamp. We do want to allow nulls there, so I'll go ahead and keep that. And then I think that's it for now. So we'll come back to this again. We're going to be talking about having, an author of a post, having comments in a post, but I think this is a good start. Okay, so the next thing we want to do here is come into our application.properties and set a few fields. So we're using the H2 database. We want to enable that console so that we can go ahead and get some insight as to, what tables and columns are being created, make sure everything looks right. We can also run SQL from there. I actually have a whole video on just how to connect to and configure the H2 console or the H2 database in your Spring Boot app. So I'll go ahead and try and link that above and below. So the next thing we need to do is we need to, there's a generate unique name property on the H2 data source. We want to say false for that. We don't want to generate a unique name. We want to go ahead and set a data source name, and we're going to set that data source name to blog. Okay, so with all of those things in place, we're getting closer. We have this post. Now we have the idea of repositories in Spring Data. So we're going to create a repository package. And in the repository, we're going to create a new interface. So this is going to be called post repository. This is going to be an interface. And all we're going to do here is extend the CRUD repository, which accepts a type and an ID type. So this type is going to be of post, and then the ID type in our post is an integer. So that's all we need to do, and just by doing that, we get some CRUD functionality out of the box, things like save all, find one, delete, etc. Okay, so most of our pieces are in place. We can now go ahead and start to add some data to the database. Now we could go into our DDL script there that created the table and the columns, and we can insert some data that way. We can also do it another way. Here in our main blog application class, I'm going to create a new bean, which is of type command line runner. So command line runner, and inside of this is actually a functional interface. So we're going to go ahead and return args. And then what I want to do is get an instance of that post repository. So post repository, posts. And inside here, I can now create a new post. So I'm going to say posts.save, and we're going to create a new post. So remember, the post constructor takes a title and some content. So I'm going to say this is, let's say hello world. And then the content is welcome to my blog. So that's all we need to create a post. So this should go ahead and persist this off to the database. Just to make sure everything's working, let's go ahead and run this app. All right, looks like everything's working. Our H2 console is available, and our database is available at JDBC H2 memory. Yeah, so that stands for in memory, and then blog. So let's head over to the browser and check that out. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and log in here. And you can see we have a post table. If you kind of drill down into it, you can see all of the columns. If you go ahead and click on it, we can execute this SQL statement. And you see that we get our one row that we inserted. So we have a title, we have a content, published on was the timestamp, and then updated on is going to be null for now. All right, so far, everything that we've done, pretty straightforward. This is probably a good time to start talking about Spring Data JDBC specifically. So if you head over to spring.io/projects, Spring Data JDBC, underneath the Learn tab, we can go ahead and look at the reference documentation. It's a really great place to start. Under reference documentation, this is really kind of the start of where we want to begin this journey. So why Spring Data JDBC when we have something like Spring Data JPA? As I mentioned early on in this tutorial, Spring Data JPA is great, but it also comes with a lot of overhead. And again, for someone new or even someone who's been doing this a long time, it can be a little overwhelming. There are things that you have to deal with. Things like tracking changes to entities. It does lazy loading for you, but that's something you have to understand how that is happening. It also does some really interesting things, the way it keeps track of those changes. It has things like eager and lazy loading. You can, when you have all of these objects, you have this huge graph of things. So it's often confusing on well, when I save this one thing, how does, what happens with everything else? So Spring Data JDBC, as it says here, aims to be much simpler conceptually by embracing the following design decisions. So if you load an entity, SQL statements get run. Once it's done, you've completely loaded an entity. There is no lazy loading or no caching. Now, you can do caching in Spring, but Spring Data JDBC is not doing that for you. If you save an entity, it gets saved. If you don't, it doesn't. There is no dirty tracking, no session, etc. The other thing that you need to think about, again, comes back to if you've done Spring Data JPA in the past. There's a simple model of how you map entities to tables. It works rather, it probably only works for rather simple cases. If you don't like that, you should code your own strategy. But Spring Data JDBC offers a limited support for customizing that strategy within annotations. So when we talk about modeling our entities to tables, we have that post entity that we've already created that gets mapped to a post table. Now we need to start thinking about how do we, what about other models in our application? If we have an author, if we have a comment, how do those things get related if there's no lazy loading, eager fetching? What happens there? And this is the first thing you really need to wrap your head around if you came from something like Spring Data JPA. So I'm not going to go through all this, but this documentation is something I would look into as you start diving in and get stuck. The first two paragraphs here are important. All the Spring Data modules are inspired by this concept of repository, aggregate root from domain-driven design. These are possibly even more important in Spring Data JDBC because they are to some extent contrary to normal practice when working with relational databases. So it's important to understand those concepts of aggregate and aggregate root. There's a really good definition over on Mountain Fowler's website talking about aggregate is a pattern in domain-driven design. The example comes, there's a couple examples in there, but we also mentioned a similar example here in the documentation. But an aggregate is really a group of entities that is guaranteed to be consistent between atomic changes to it. A classic example of this is order with order items. A property on order, for example, number of items, is consistent with the actual number of order items. So understanding what aggregates are, aggregate roots, it's an important concept for what we're going to get into now. So if you want to take some time to go through the documentation, if you haven't read Domain-Driven Design by Eric Evans, I wouldn't say pause this video and do that because that's going to take a long time, but just kind of getting up to date with some of those concepts. So with that, let's head back to the application. Okay, so now I want to talk about creating an author. So an author doesn't really belong to a post. An author kind of stands on its own. So this is going to be its own aggregate. So when we talk about aggregates in Spring Data JDBC, what we're talking about here is, will it have its own repository? Do I need to go look up authors specifically just to find an author? And in this case, I think yes. So we're going to have an author stand on its own. It's going to be its own aggregate. So we're going to create a new model. So I'm going to create a new Java class. We're going to call this author. This one is going to be pretty simple. So I'm going to go ahead and create a record. And this record is going to have an integer ID. We'll say a string first name, string last name, string email, and string username. Okay, so with all of those properties in place, I'm going to go ahead and mark this with that ID. And let's see if we can't put these on separate lines. That looks good. So now that we have that, we want to create a repository for that. So I'm going to come in here and create an author repository. And that's going to be an interface. Again, extends CRUD repository. The type is author. The ID type is integer. So with that, we're getting closer. We need to go back down to our schema. And now we need to go ahead and update our schema here. So we are going to create a new table here for, let's say, author. So I'm going to create a table called author. Again, some of the same stuff here. Let's just copy that. Oh boy, look at that. That's what I get for copy pasting. So we're going to have first name. That is going to be varchar of 100, not null. We'll have a last name. That looks pretty similar. We're going to have an email. So this is going to be, let's just make this a little bit longer. We don't want that null. And finally, we have a username. This is going to be 100, and we don't want that null. Okay, so far it looks pretty good, right? Now, in a normal schema design here, we need to have a way to kind of tie these two together, right? When I am writing a new post on my blog, I am the author. I need to somehow let that post know that I am the one writing it. And the way that we usually do this is by having a foreign key. So here what I want to do is I'm going to say, I'm going to say the author is going to have of type integer. And what I'll say is foreign key. So the foreign key author is going to reference author ID. And so that will kind of tie those together. So when we insert a new post, we are going to insert the ID of the author into the author column. All right, so now we were able to go ahead and model that relationship between the database tables. So we have this ID, we are tying an author to a post. But how do we represent that in our Java code? And that's where we need to go ahead and take a look at the documentation again. So if we look at supported types in your entities, one of the things down here in the documentation, we'll kind of go through that and explain it. But basically, if you have an N-to-one or N-to-M, so one-to-one or one-to-many references, you are by definition dealing with two separate aggregates. Here's something that really stuck out for me when I was trying to learn this. Basically, in Spring Data JDBC, you're managing two types of relationships. Relationships between aggregates, so post and author, the one that we're looking at now, and then relationships within aggregate roots. So as we get to posts and comments, I'll remind you of this again, but that's a separate type of relationship we're managing. So this one, we're managing a relationship between two aggregates, between post and author. So references between those may just be encoded as a simple ID. In my post, I have an author ID, and that's how I kind of map between them. A better way to encode these is to make them instances of aggregate reference. And an aggregate reference is really just a wrapper around an ID value, which marks that value as a reference to a different aggregate. Also, the type of the aggregate is encoded in the type parameter, like it is here. So, knowing that, let's go back to our code here, and in post, we're going to come back and fill in this author. And so what we're going to do here is we're going to say private aggregate reference. So aggregate reference, the type is an author. And then we need to pass in the ID type. So that is an integer. And we'll just call this author. So now we've kind of mapped those two. So now what we can do is go back to our blog application. And what we want to do is we want to create a new author. So to do that, I want to go ahead and get a reference to the author repository. We'll call this authors. And now in here, I can say authors.save. And so I want to create a new author. So I'm going to create a new author. Now this is a record. In Spring Data JDBC, we need to pass in some kind of ID here. What we want to do is we want to pass in null. If you pass in any type of ID, Spring Data JDBC thinks that it's performing an update. In this case, if we pass in null, it thinks it's going to do an insert. So we're going to pass in null. We're going to pass in Dan as the first name, Vega, danvega@gmail.com, and then the username will be dvega. So that is going to create a new author in the database. But what we want to get back from this is actually that aggregate reference, right? Because when we create a new post, we want to pass in that aggregate reference. So to do that, I'm going to say aggregate reference. And then there is a static method on there called to. So I can say to. And let's go ahead and add one more here. And that will give us back exactly what we need to go ahead and pass the post. So I'm going to introduce a local variable. We'll go ahead and call this, let's just call it Dan. And now I can go ahead and update my post. So I want to say aggregate reference of author, integer. We'll call this author. And now what I can do is say this.author is equal to author. So we have one problem. We need to go ahead and update our constructor call here. And so let's go ahead and pass in Dan. Okay, and we're getting an error here. What did we do here? So we're calling new author. We probably need to get back that ID for this to work, huh? No. What did we do wrong here? Oh, aggregate reference of, that should be author and integer. And then what is this saying? No instance of type variable exists. So the author conforms to integer. What did we do? We need to get back the ID. That should work. Okay, so no more errors. We're persisting a new author to the database. And what we want to get back is that aggregate reference. So then we can pass that into posts. Now, again, remember, so if you're coming from the Spring Data JPA world, you might have some way of cascading that save down, right? In Spring Data JDBC, these are two separate aggregates. So we need to save the author aggregate first. We need to save the post next. In this case, we're just setting the reference to that particular author. So let's see if this works. I'm going to go ahead and restart that. See if we can go ahead and start up without any errors. Oh, so far so good. Let's head back to the H2 console. And I'll go ahead and connect to this. And we see we have post and author. Let's go ahead and see this. So good. I do have an author in there. Let's go ahead and hit post. So we have an ID, a version, title, content, published updated, and we have an author ID of 1, which again is our primary key back to the author table. All right, so far so good. Now we need to take a look at comments. So we have the idea of an author and a post. We need to go ahead and model out a comment. So let's go ahead and create a comment. This is just going to be a class. We'll call it comment. And in here, we'll create a few fields. We'll say private string name, private string content. Again, I'm going to do like a private, let's say local date time, published on. And then what if we go ahead and update that comment? Let's do something similar. So we'll say updated on. And I think that's it. So then we'll go ahead and create a public comment. Again, I'll just take in a name and the content, so whatever the comment is, and then I will say this dot name is equal to name, this dot content is equal to content. Okay, let's create some getters and setters, and we'll do that, and then we'll also go ahead and create a toString. All right, so far so good. Now the big difference here is this comment is not going to be an aggregate. This is going to belong to a post. So the aggregate root for this is going to be a post. So when we talk about aggregates, do we say like, can this comment kind of live and breathe on its own? Now, in a much larger blogging application, maybe it does. Maybe there's a scenario where I need a repository for comments. I need to be able to find all the comments. I need to like do a whole bunch of filtering and paging and sorting on comments. For my tiny blog on the internet that, I've been blogging for 20 years and I almost never got comments. Maybe my work is just not that interesting, but in my scenario, I know what the amount of comments are going to be. So I think that this really is something that's going to belong to a post. So an aggregate is we have all of these different objects that all kind of belong to one entity, if you will. So a post and a comment kind of belong together. So how does that work? So now we will have a separate table for this, but we're not, you notice that we don't have an ID in here. We're not going to mark this with that ID. We're not going to have a repository for it. So let's go back. Let's start with the schema. So we need to create a schema for comment. What does that look like? So we'll come in here and we'll say comment. We're going to create a new table called comment. And again, the aggregate part is really in the Java world, right? As far as a database goes, and a relational database goes, we still have a table for comments. And this is going to include things like name, so varchar. So this is going to be 100, not null. We would have something like the content could be a whole bunch of text. We're going to have that published. Let's just do this. This is pretty much the same as that. And so we'll do that. So now the question really becomes, okay, if this doesn't have an ID, what does it have? Well, if you go through the documentation for Spring Data JDBC, you'll see that in this type of relationship, we're going to have a column as the name of the aggregate root. In this case, it's going to be post. And so that is an integer. We obviously don't want that to be null. What we'll also do here is just set up a foreign key, which will go the post, and that references the post ID. So that's how we model the relationship here in the database schema. So now that all looks good. What we need to do is go back to post. So let's go ahead and fill this in. So at the end of the day, a post is going to have some type of collection of comments. In our case, this can be a set because we will have no duplicate comments, and we can go ahead and say these are of type comment. We'll call this comments, and that will, let's see, actually, let's go ahead and say new hash set. We'll initialize that, and that will give us that. All right, let's go ahead and we're going to add a getter and a setter for those comments. So I'm going to say getter and setter. Oh, we actually didn't add one for our author. So let's go ahead and set those. And now I need a way to add comments. So what I'm going to do is create a new method in here. We will go ahead and say public void add comment. And this is going to take in a comment. And all we're going to do is we're going to say comments dot add, and then we add in that comment. Now there's one more trick to this. Not really a trick, but what we want to do is we have this post and we have all the comments that belong to this post. But now we need to set a reference on the other side of this relationship, right? So how can we do that in the comment? We can actually just set a reference to it. Now the trick here is we actually want to mark this with that transient, because what we're saying is don't persist this off to the database. This is really just a reference. So now back in post, what I can do is I can say the comment.post is equal to this. So now we've set a back reference to it. So with that in place, we should have everything we need to go ahead and add some comments to our post that we created here. So let's go ahead and introduce a local variable here. We'll call this post. And then in here, I want to create some new comments. And the way that I do that is I just say post.add comment. And so now I just want to go ahead and pass in a new comment. So I can say new comment, and I can say, what is it? What was the constructor looking like? So name and content. So I'm going to say my name is Dan, and the content is, this is my first comment. So that is passing in a new comment. And then what we can do, actually we want to, I don't want to save this yet, right? So what I want to do is I want to just create a new post, add the comment to it, and now say post.save, and I want to save that post. So remember, what we're saying here is that post and comments kind of belong together, right? We are saying that that post is the aggregate root. So when we save a post, anything that is associated with it will now get saved. So because comment belongs to the aggregate root post, that will go ahead and get persisted now. So let's see if that will go ahead and work. Let's try and restart our application. And we did get an error. Let's see what we got here. Null, not allowed for column published on. Okay, so we need some values for that. Let's go back to comment. And what we want to do is we want to set this dot published on equal to local date time dot now. Let's try and start that again. And okay, so that looks good. Let's head back to the H2 console and see if those values got inserted. All right, so I'm here. I'm going to go ahead and look at comment. If we go ahead and select from there, we see our one comment. The content, the published on, updated is null. So you see the post is now that reference back to the post that was inserted. So if we look at post, that should have an ID of 1. And now that is how we tie that comment to this post. All right, so we are moving right along here. I think what I want to do is kind of tie this all together. We're going to create a controller, a REST controller that we can go ahead and hit and kind of see some of the data that we're going to get back. And that will allow us to talk about one more thing that I want to cover today. So let's go ahead and create a new package. We'll call this controller. Inside of controller, we'll create a new Java class and we'll call this post controller. We'll mark this with @REST controller and we'll say the request mapping is for /API/posts. So I'm going to need a couple things in here. I'm going to need a post repository. We'll call this posts. And I'm also going to need a author repository. We'll call this authors. So I'm going to go ahead and say add this as a constructor parameter to our constructor. And then I want to go ahead and have a get mapping. So we'll say public iterable of post. And we'll say this is find all, and we're going to use the posts repository and go ahead and find all. So that should return that, Dan, not just call it. Okay, so far so good. Let's go ahead and restart this application and see if we can hit that API. All right, so we're here at localhost 8080. I'll go to /API/posts. And cool, so far so good. We have some data here. So let's look at this. One, we have the ID coming through of the post. We probably want to hide that in the return, in the response. So we'll talk about that. We have a title, content, published on, the updated on is null. Good. The author that we have coming back is just an object with an ID, because again, that is that aggregate reference to author. It's really just an ID. We may want some more information about that author to display on a page somewhere, right? And then you can see we're getting that set of comments back. So we have some comments and we get the name, content, published on, and updated on. So I think the only thing I want to fix there is how can I get the, well, in this case, I don't think I would care about it, right? So if I'm just listing all the posts, maybe I would. But I think this matters more on like a post detail page, right? So let's take a look at this. I want to go ahead and say get mapping. What if I was trying to get a specific post? So public post, find by ID, and that would take in a path variable. And that would be an integer ID. And that would return our post repository dot find by ID and pass in that ID. So we would, oops. So that is actually going to return an optional. So we're going to say or else null. So let's see if that works. Let's go ahead and rerun that. We're going to try and hit that API at /posts/1. So let's do that. Cool. So same thing, just got that single post. But as I said, we may want an instance where we want to get some details about that particular post. So I'm going to change this up. Or actually, let's talk about this. Let's talk about creating what we call a data transfer object, right? So in this case, I have a post and I have an author. These are two separate aggregates, but in one response, I may want to have them both, right? So let's go in here in model. I'm going to create a new, let's say, package called DTO. And in here, I'm going to create something called a post details. And this is going to be a record. And so a post details may just contain a post, which is called post, and an author, which is called author. So that will have everything that I need. So let's go ahead and create another mapping here. I'm going to say this is going to be so for/details find by ID. Let's just call this get post details. And so this is going to take in a similar thing. It'll take in the path variable for that post. But what we're going to return is a little bit different. All we're returning is a new post details. And so we're passing in that post. So this is going to be the same as above, find by ID. So we get the, oh, sorry. So this is post dot find by ID. So ID dot or else null. And then we need to pass in an author. So how do we get the author? Well, what we can do is we can use the authors repository. So authors dot, we can find by that ID. And the way that we're going to get that ID is from the post that we created. So we actually want to probably get this. So let's say that, introduce a local variable called post. Go ahead and pass that in. And then we'll say the post get author dot get ID. That should give us exactly what we need to get. So now what we're doing is we're passing in, so we want to change this. So we want to return post details And that should give us what we want. So now if we go ahead and refresh this, now in a case where I need the posts with all the details, I can say /details. And now, instead of just getting that author ID, I will go ahead and get an author object on there. So now I can display, say, the first name, last name, email, username, whatever I need to display there. So that really is, again, the biggest hurdle if you've used JPA before is understanding the relationships. As I said earlier, you have to manage two types of relationships. One between aggregates, so between the post and the author, and then one within the aggregate, which is, in our case, posts and comments. So once you kind of wrap your head around that stuff, there's some other little nuances and challenges that you have to understand. But for me, it simplifies everything. You know, there is no like wondering what happened behind the scenes. You can see the SQL right here in the console. You can go ahead and turn on some debugging to get that out, but you can see exactly what's going on. And so I really appreciate some of the simplicity of Spring Data JDBC. And now that I understand it a little bit better, I'm going to be using it in more of my projects. I'm excited to hear from all of you. Have you used Spring Data JDBC before? What are your initial thoughts on it? Are you using it in real world projects? So again, this was my kind of first dive into it. I've used it in the past, but just for simple stuff. This was a good chance to understand some of these relationships. So, hey, I hope you enjoyed this tutorial. If you found some value in it, do me a favor, hit that thumbs up, hit that subscribe button. And as always, friends, happy coding.